Isabel Morales was the kind of woman people admired from a distance. At 35, she had built a reputation as one of the most sought-after corporate attorneys in the city. Her career was dazzling, meteoric even, if you believed the headlines that often featured her name. She had it all: the corner office with a view of the skyline, an apartment that screamed sophistication with its sleek glass furniture and high-end art, and a calendar booked months in advance with high-profile clients. Yet, none of it felt as glamorous or fulfilling as it should have. On most mornings, Isabel's reflection in the mirror revealed a well-put-together woman, meticulous in her appearance, her tailored suits a perfect fit for the persona she had carefully cultivated over the years. The dark circles under her eyes, though, told a different story. One of sleepless nights and inner turmoil. She ignored them the same way she ignored the gnawing emptiness that had been growing inside her for years. Work had always been a convenient distraction, something she could throw herself into fully, as if the cases she took on could somehow fill the void. But now, after her mother's death, that void had grown so large that even work couldn't contain it. Her mother, Clara, had been gone for nearly a month now. Isabel had arranged a beautiful funeral, attended by a few of Clara's old friends and some distant relatives, but she felt like a stranger throughout the whole affair. The memories from her childhood, long suppressed under layers of ambition and self-discipline, began to resurface in the weeks following the service. Clara had been a single mother, a fact Isabel had always carried with her like an unspoken burden. Her mother's strictness was legendary. Nothing Isabel ever did seemed good enough. Clara had high expectations, impossible ones, Isabel often thought. And though she'd spent most of her adult life running from her past, striving to meet those unspoken expectations, she now found herself haunted by everything left unresolved between them. Isabel sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the worn photo of her mother she'd kept tucked away for years. The frame was cheap, the kind you pick up at a convenience store, and the photo inside was just as mundane. A portrait of Clara in her early 30s, dressed simply, her expression stern. It was the only photograph Isabel had kept, mostly because it encapsulated everything their relationship had been: formal, distant, and cold. In life, her mother had never been the type for grand gestures of love. Clara was an enigma, silent about her past, resolute in her stoicism. Isabel had asked once, just once, about her father when she was 12, and the fury that erupted from Clara had ensured Isabel would never ask again. Their relationship had become a transactional one. Clara provided for her, ensured she had the best education and opportunities, but the love, the warmth, was absent. Isabel grew up in that emotional wasteland, molding herself into the perfect daughter academically, but always falling short in Clara's eyes. Now, after Clara's death, Isabel was left with a sense of unfinished business. There were questions she had never asked, questions she had forced herself to believe didn't matter anymore. She had made peace with the idea that she'd never truly know her mother. Or at least, she thought she had. But something was different now. Isabel felt a strange weight pressing on her, as if something important had been left unsaid. There were no parting words between them, no tender moments at Clara's bedside before she passed. There hadn't even been time for goodbyes. Clara's illness had progressed so quickly, leaving Isabel stunned and unprepared. One moment, she had been in court arguing a case, and the next, she was standing over her mother's frail, lifeless body in a sterile hospital room. The numbness that had followed the funeral was beginning to fade, replaced by a kind of dull ache she couldn't shake. Isabel was realizing, with a painful clarity, that she didn't know who her mother had really been. The years of silence, the strict upbringing, the emotional distance. There had to be a reason behind it all. What was Clara hiding? And why had she never allowed Isabel to know her fully? Despite all the success Isabel had achieved, the weight of her unresolved feelings toward Clara dragged her down. She could feel it pulling her deeper into the isolation she had carefully built around herself. The polished image she presented to the world was nothing more than a facade. Inside, she was unraveling. Isabel had no close relationships. She'd had a few lovers over the years, all fleeting, none of them lasting long enough to leave a mark. Friendship was something she could never quite grasp. She had tried, in her 20s, to be part of social circles, but the effort always felt exhausting. It was easier to be alone. Solitude had become her companion, her shield against the emotional minefield she had buried so long ago. If she let anyone get too close, they might see her for what she truly was, damaged, incomplete, and haunted by the ghost of a woman she never fully understood. Her apartment, pristine and tastefully furnished, was empty in all the ways that mattered. The walls, lined with accolades and awards, did little to bring her comfort. The loneliness that she had always managed to ignore now settled into every corner of her life. Work wasn't enough anymore. The late nights at the office, the never-ending cases, they only served to distract her for so long. When she returned home to the silence, the grief was there waiting for her. And so she drifted, through her days and nights, unable to reconcile the conflicting emotions that plagued her. Guilt, anger, and sadness intertwined, keeping her tethered to memories of a mother she had loved but never truly known. Clara had been many things, distant, cold, sometimes even cruel. But now, Isabel wondered if she had misunderstood her all along. If maybe there had been more to Clara than she had ever been willing to share. Isabel had never been one to dwell on the past. She had always prided herself on moving forward, relentlessly focusing on the next step, the next goal. But today, the past felt unshakable, like a shadow that followed her no matter how far she walked. The morning air was crisp as she left her apartment, heading for her office. The city was alive, buzzing with the sound of traffic and hurried footsteps. Normally the chaos soothed her, providing a distraction from the restless thoughts that tugged at her. Today, though, it felt different. Her mother's absence hung in the air, thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. She pushed it aside, as she always did, focusing on the routine of her day. She had a meeting with a new client, a potential case that could elevate her profile even further. But the thrill that usually came with such prospects was absent. Everything felt dulled, muted, like a film placed over her life that she couldn't quite peel away. As she neared her office building, her eyes fell on a figure sitting on the steps outside. The young woman looked out of place against the sleek, modern architecture of the building, her clothes worn and frayed, her hair messy. She sat hunched over, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if to ward off the chill of the morning air. Something about her posture, small, defeated, struck Isabel, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Isabel quickened her pace, instinctively avoiding eye contact. She didn't have time for distractions. She barely had time for herself. But as she reached the door, she found her feet slowing against her will, and something inside her made her turn back. There was a haunted look in the young woman's eyes, one Isabel couldn't ignore. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, as if holding back words, or maybe holding back tears. Isabel had seen that look before, on her own face in the mirror after her mother's death, and long before that, in the fleeting moments of vulnerability that Clara had allowed her to witness during her childhood. "Are you all right?" The question slipped out before Isabel could stop herself. The woman flinched, as if she hadn't expected anyone to speak to her. She looked up, her eyes wide and startled before quickly averting them. "I'm fine," she mumbled, though the tremble in her voice betrayed the lie. Isabel knew she should walk away. There was nothing she could do for this stranger, no reason for her to get involved. But something, perhaps the hint of shared grief in the woman's expression, compelled her to stay. "You look like you've been out here a while," Isabel said, her tone softer now, less businesslike. "Do you need help?" The young woman shook her head again, but Isabel could see her hands trembling as she tightened her grip around her knees. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy between them. Isabel glanced at her watch, the urge to leave pressing against the strange, unexplainable instinct to stay. Finally, the woman broke the silence. "I lost someone." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together, as if trying to hold herself together through sheer force of will. Isabel recognized the rawness in her tone, the way grief could make you feel like you were unraveling in front of the world with no way to stop it. "I'm sorry," Isabel said, unsure of what else to offer. The words felt hollow, inadequate, but she couldn't seem to find anything more meaningful to say. She didn't know this woman, didn't know the depth of her pain, but something about her vulnerability resonated in a way Isabel hadn't expected. For a long moment, the young woman didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It doesn't matter. Nothing really does." Isabel stared at her, the weight of the statement sinking in. Those words, so final, so devoid of hope, clung to the cold air between them, and for a brief second, Isabel felt the familiar emptiness inside herself swell. She had been so close to saying something similar after Clara died, so close to letting that darkness take over. But she had shoved it down, buried it beneath her work and her responsibilities, hoping that if she ignored it long enough, it would fade. Clearly, it hadn't. Before she knew what she was doing, Isabel reached into her bag and pulled out a few bills. She wasn't sure if the woman needed money, but it was the only thing she could think to offer in that moment. "Here," she said, extending her hand. "Take this. Get yourself something to eat or a place to stay, at least for the night." The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering between the money and Isabel's face, uncertainty written in the lines of her expression. After what felt like an eternity, she reached out and took the bills, her fingers brushing against Isabel's briefly. It was such a small gesture, but the contact sent an unexpected jolt through Isabel, as though something intangible passed between them in that moment. "Thank you," the woman murmured, her voice still barely audible. She clutched the money tightly, as if afraid it might vanish if she didn't hold on with all her strength. Isabel nodded, unsure of what else to say. The strange heaviness in her chest lingered as she turned and walked toward the office doors. But even as she stepped into the building's familiar, sterile environment, her thoughts remained with the young woman outside. There was something in the girl's eyes that Isabel couldn't shake. Something that mirrored her own pain. As the elevator doors slid shut behind her, Isabel found herself wondering if she had done enough. The girl had been lost, just as Isabel had been after Clara's death. It wasn't just the grief, it was the helplessness that came with it. The sense that no matter how hard you tried, the pieces of your life would never fit back together the way they once had. For Isabel, that feeling had never truly left. She carried it with her, a constant companion she never acknowledged. By the time she reached her office, the encounter had lodged itself firmly in her mind. The image of the girl on the steps, her hollow eyes, and trembling hands wouldn't leave her. Isabel knew she wouldn't see her again. The city was too big, too busy. People came and went, their stories intertwining for brief moments before separating forever. But still, the girl's words echoed in her mind, gnawing at the edges of her carefully maintained composure. "It doesn't matter. Nothing really does." Isabel closed her eyes, leaning back in her chair, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She wasn't used to this uncertainty, this unsettling emotion that seemed to rise unbidden from somewhere deep inside her. She had built her life on control, on certainty, and the encounter with the girl had thrown all of that into disarray. The truth was, Isabel wasn't sure if anything mattered anymore either. Not without her mother. Not with all the unanswered questions that now plagued her every thought. She had spent years building walls around herself, but today, for the first time, she felt those walls crack, just a little. And it terrified her. The next day, Isabel did something she rarely ever did. She skipped work. The thought had come to her in the early hours of the morning, when she was lying awake, staring at the ceiling of her darkened bedroom, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. It had been a restless night, her mind circling the same thoughts over and over. Memories of Clara, questions she could no longer ask, and the face of that young woman from the steps, her hollow eyes etched into Isabel's mind. It had been years since Isabel had visited her mother's grave. In fact, she had only been there once, on the day of the funeral. The cemetery was tucked away on the outskirts of the city, far enough that it felt like another world. It wasn't a place Isabel had any desire to return to until today. She couldn't quite explain why she felt the pull to go back. Perhaps it was a need for some kind of closure, a desperate attempt to shake the grief that had embedded itself so deeply in her chest that she feared it would never leave. The cemetery was quiet, the air thick with the stillness that only came in places of mourning. Isabel's heels clicked against the gravel path as she walked between the rows of headstones, the familiar pang of loss tightening in her throat. She had brought flowers, though she wasn't sure why. Clara had never been one for sentimentality, never been the type to appreciate gestures. Yet here Isabel was, clutching a bouquet of lilies, her mother's favorite as far as she could remember, feeling like a child again, unsure of how to navigate this unfamiliar terrain of grief. When she reached the grave, she stood there for a long moment, staring at the stone slab with her mother's name etched in clean, elegant lines. Clara Morales, 1951 to 2023, beloved mother. The words felt hollow, almost mocking. Isabel had chosen the inscription, but now, standing here, she realized how little she had known about the woman buried beneath the earth. What had Clara truly felt in those final moments? Had she thought of Isabel? Had she regretted the years of silence between them? Isabel knelt down, placing the lilies at the base of the headstone. Her fingers brushed the cold stone, and for a moment a surge of emotion threatened to overwhelm her. She clenched her jaw, swallowing back the lump in her throat. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not here, not now. As she stood up, preparing to leave, movement caught her eye. Just a few rows away, sitting on a bench near another grave, was the young woman from the steps. The same disheveled hair, the same worn clothes. Isabel blinked, certain she must be imagining things. What were the odds that this girl, this stranger, would be here, in the same cemetery, at the same moment? It was too much to be a coincidence. Isabel felt her heart skip a beat as the young woman looked up and met her gaze. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was a flash of recognition in the girl's eyes, followed by something else, something darker, more complicated. Isabel hesitated, unsure of what to do, but before she could make a decision, the young woman rose from the bench and began walking toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest as the girl approached, her footsteps slow and deliberate. When she reached Isabel, she paused, standing a few feet away, her eyes searching Isabel's face as if she were trying to figure something out. "You," the young woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From the office building." Isabel nodded, unsure of what to say. The girl looked different today, less guarded, but somehow more fragile, as if the weight of her grief had finally broken through the walls she had built around herself. "What are you doing here?" Isabel asked, her voice softer than she intended. The girl glanced at the grave she had been sitting by, her eyes clouding with sadness. "My mother," she said quietly. "She died a few weeks ago." A chill ran down Isabel's spine. The coincidence was too eerie. They had both lost their mothers, both women haunted by grief that seemed to cling to them like a second skin. But there was something more, something Isabel couldn't quite put her finger on. "I'm sorry," Isabel said, the words feeling inadequate yet again. She found herself staring at the girl, trying to make sense of the strange connection she felt to her. The girl offered a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks, it's been hard." Isabel nodded, the silence between them growing heavier. She was about to say something else when the girl reached into her bag, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she held it out to Isabel. "I wasn't sure if I should show you this," the girl said, her voice wavering. "But I found it in my mother's things. It's a letter. It's addressed to someone named Clara Morales. Your mother, right?" The world seemed to tilt beneath Isabel's feet as she stared at the letter in the girl's outstretched hand. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The name on the letter was unmistakable. Clara, her mother. Slowly, as if in a daze, Isabel reached out and took the letter from the girl's trembling hands. The paper felt old, fragile, as though it had been hidden away for years. Isabel's fingers brushed the edges of the envelope, and her heart raced with a mixture of confusion and dread. How was it possible that this girl, a stranger, had something that belonged to her mother? "I don't understand," Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did your mother have this?" The girl shook her head, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know. I only found it a few days ago, tucked away in one of her old boxes. I've been trying to figure it out ever since." Isabel swallowed hard, her mind spinning. She wanted to open the letter, to tear it apart and read whatever secrets it held, but something stopped her. The letter felt like a key to something she wasn't sure she was ready to unlock. What if it revealed something she couldn't handle? What if it changed everything she thought she knew about her mother? Are you all right? The question slipped out before Isabel could stop herself. The woman flinched, as if she hadn't expected anyone to speak to her. She looked up, her eyes wide and startled before quickly averting them. "I'm fine," she mumbled, though the tremble in her voice betrayed the lie. Isabel knew she should walk away. There was nothing she could do for this stranger, no reason for her to get involved. But something, perhaps the hint of shared grief in the woman's expression, compelled her to stay. "You look like you've been out here a while," Isabel said, her tone softer now, less businesslike. "Do you need help?" The young woman shook her head again, but Isabel could see her hands trembling as she tightened her grip around her knees. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy between them. Isabel glanced at her watch, the urge to leave pressing against the strange, unexplainable instinct to stay. Finally, the woman broke the silence. "I lost someone." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together, as if trying to hold herself together through sheer force of will. Isabel recognized the rawness in her tone, the way grief could make you feel like you were unraveling in front of the world with no way to stop it. "I'm sorry," Isabel said, unsure of what else to offer. The words felt hollow, inadequate, but she couldn't seem to find anything more meaningful to say. She didn't know this woman, didn't know the depth of her pain, but something about her vulnerability resonated in a way Isabel hadn't expected. For a long moment, the young woman didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It doesn't matter. Nothing really does." Isabel stared at her, the weight of the statement sinking in. Those words, so final, so devoid of hope, clung to the cold air between them, and for a brief second, Isabel felt the familiar emptiness inside herself swell. She had been so close to saying something similar after Clara died, so close to letting that darkness take over. But she had shoved it down, buried it beneath her work and her responsibilities, hoping that if she ignored it long enough, it would fade. Clearly, it hadn't. Before she knew what she was doing, Isabel reached into her bag and pulled out a few bills. She wasn't sure if the woman needed money, but it was the only thing she could think to offer in that moment. "Here," she said, extending her hand. "Take this. Get yourself something to eat or a place to stay, at least for the night." The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering between the money and Isabel's face, uncertainty written in the lines of her expression. After what felt like an eternity, she reached out and took the bills, her fingers brushing against Isabel's briefly. It was such a small gesture, but the contact sent an unexpected jolt through Isabel, as though something intangible passed between them in that moment. "How?" Isabel's voice cracked, and she had to swallow hard before she could speak again. "How did your mother know Clara?" Anna's eyes were filled with uncertainty, mirroring Isabel's own confusion. "I don't know," she whispered. "I didn't even know who Clara was until I found that letter. My mother, my adoptive mother, never talked about anything like this. I thought maybe you would have answers." Answers. Isabel could barely process what she had just read, let alone the idea that she might have answers. She had spent her entire life believing she was her mother's only child, the only one Clara had ever cared for, if you could even call it that. But now, everything felt like a lie. Had Clara given Anna up for adoption? Was Anna the child her mother had mentioned in vague, cryptic stories about a past Isabel had never been allowed to explore? "I didn't know," Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know about you." Anna stared at her for a long moment, the weight of the revelation settling between them like a dense fog. So it's true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Clara, your mother, was my biological mother?" Isabel didn't know how to answer that. She didn't know if she could believe it herself, but the evidence was there, written in her mother's own hand, the words filled with regret and love that Isabel had never known her mother was capable of expressing. The realization hit her like a blow. Clara had kept this enormous secret from her for her entire life. Suddenly, the cemetery felt too small, too suffocating. Isabel needed space, she needed air. She could feel her control slipping, the carefully constructed walls she had built over the years crumbling around her. Without another word, she turned and began walking briskly toward her car, her footsteps quick and uneven against the gravel path. Anna called after her, but Isabel couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything had come crashing down around her. The drive home was a blur. By the time she reached her apartment, her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely unlock the door. Once inside, she collapsed onto the couch, her mind racing, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The letter, Anna's face, her mother's coldness, it all swirled together in a chaotic storm she couldn't control. The questions screamed inside her mind. Why had Clara never told her? Why had she hidden this other life, this other child, from Isabel? What kind of woman had Clara truly been? Isabel had spent years believing her mother was distant because she had been hardened by life, by the struggles of raising a child alone. But now she wasn't sure what to believe. There was a dull ache building in Isabel's chest, a sense of betrayal she couldn't shake. Her entire life she had tried to be the perfect daughter, to live up to Clara's impossible expectations. And now she found out that her mother had been living with a secret that could have shattered everything. It wasn't just the secret that hurt, it was the fact that Clara had taken it to her grave, never giving Isabel the chance to understand, to make peace with the truth. Isabel knew she couldn't leave it like this. She had to know more. She had to find out what had really happened all those years ago. Clara had never been forthcoming with stories about her past, but there were pieces, fragments, that might still exist in her mother's old belongings. Isabel hadn't gone through Clara's things after she died. The thought of facing her mother's personal items had been too painful, too real. But now, it was the only option. She found herself standing in front of the storage boxes Clara had left behind, the ones Isabel had shoved into the back of her closet without a second thought. Her hands trembled as she opened the first box, filled with old papers, photographs, and letters. She sifted through them carefully, her breath catching every time she came across something from her childhood. A school report card, a drawing she had made for her mother when she was 8. But nothing pointed to Clara's past, nothing explained the letter. And then, buried at the bottom of the second box, Isabel found it. An old, worn journal, its cover faded with age. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, before carefully opening it. The handwriting inside was Clara's, but it was different from the neat, controlled script Isabel was used to. This was messier, more erratic, as though Clara had written these entries in a state of emotional upheaval. As Isabel read through the first few pages, her hands grew cold. Clara had written about a child, a baby she had given up for adoption when she was barely out of her 20s. She described the pain of the decision, the guilt that had haunted her every day since. There were no details about the father, no explanation for why she had chosen to give the baby away, only the raw emotion of a mother who had never been able to forget the child she had lost. Tears stung Isabel's eyes as she continued reading, the words blurring on the page. Clara had written about how the experience had changed her, how it had made her more closed off, more afraid of losing anyone else she loved. And then, in one heartbreaking entry, Clara had written about Isabel. I don't know how to love her the way she deserves. I'm afraid that if I love her too much, I'll lose her too, just like I lost Anna. I can't bear the thought of going through that kind of pain again. The words cut through Isabel like a knife. All those years, she had believed that her mother's distance was a sign of indifference, of coldness. But now, she realized it had been fear. Clara had been afraid of loving her, afraid of losing her, and that fear had shaped their entire relationship. It didn't excuse the way Clara had treated her, but it explained so much. Isabel closed the journal, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth. She could feel her anger dissolving, replaced by a deep sadness she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. Her mother had been broken, just as much as Isabel had been. They had both been trapped in their own prisons, unable to reach each other. But now, Isabel knew. And she couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to speak to Anna again. The next few days passed in a haze for Isabel. She went through the motions, work, meetings, client consultations, but none of it registered. Her mind was elsewhere, circling around the revelations that had come to light. The journal entries replayed in her head, over and over, as if her mother's words had imprinted themselves on her soul. She could no longer ignore the reality that had been uncovered. nor could she push away the sense of unfinished business that clung to her. Anna was out there, carrying the same grief, the same confusion, and probably more questions than Isabel herself had. Isabel knew what she had to do. She had to see Anna again, not just to find out more about the past, but because something inside her had shifted. She wasn't alone in this anymore. For the first time in her life, she had the chance to understand where she came from, to face the hidden parts of her family's history, and maybe to forge a connection she had never thought possible. But how could she approach Anna? The young woman had already given Isabel the letter, the first key to unlocking Clara's past. And Isabel had walked away. The thought gnawed at her. Would Anna even want to see her again? After all, Isabel hadn't exactly been forthcoming when they'd met at the cemetery. She'd run, leaving Anna standing there with her own unanswered questions. Late one evening, after another long and fruitless day at work, Isabel found herself dialing the number on the small piece of paper Anna had given her, the one she had tucked into her purse after their encounter at the grave. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button for what felt like an eternity before she pressed it. The phone rang once, twice. Isabel held her breath. "Hello?" Anna's voice came through, tentative, uncertain. Isabel swallowed hard, feeling her throat tighten with nerves. "Anna? It's Isabel." There was a pause on the other end, the silence stretching out uncomfortably before Anna responded, her voice softer now. "Isabel, I didn't think you'd call." "I didn't either." Isabel admitted, her fingers tightening around the phone. "But I've been thinking about the letter, about my mother, and about you." Anna was quiet, but Isabel could hear her breathing on the other end. She imagined the girl sitting somewhere alone, her grief as heavy as Isabel's own. "I found something," Isabel continued, her voice wavering slightly. "Something in my mother's things. A journal. It explained a lot. Things I didn't know about her, about you." "About me?" Anna's voice was cautious, guarded, as if she wasn't sure she could believe what Isabel was saying. "Yes," Isabel replied softly. I think my mother was your biological mother." Another long pause. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for Anna's response. She could hear a tremor in the young woman's breath, as if she were trying to hold back a flood of emotion. "I always wondered," Anna finally said, her voice breaking. "I always wondered where I came from, why my birth mother gave me up. But I never thought I'd actually find out." Isabel closed her eyes, the weight of Anna's words settling heavily on her. "I think Clara, our mother, was trying to protect herself. I don't think she ever stopped thinking about you. But she was scared. Scared of losing more people she loved." A quiet sob came through the phone, and Isabel's heart ached. She felt the urge to reach through the phone, to comfort Anna in some way, though she knew there was little she could say to ease the pain of these revelations. "Can we meet?" Isabel asked gently. "There's more I want to show you. My mother's journal. There are parts I think you should see. I think it might help both of us make sense of all of this." There was another pause, but this time it was shorter. "Yeah," Anna whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I need to." They arranged to meet at a small cafe the next morning, and when Isabel hung up, she sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in her hand. This was it, the moment that would change everything. She had spent years believing she was alone in the world, that her relationship with her mother had been the only defining piece of her family history. But now she was realizing that she had a chance, however fragile, to rewrite that story. The next day, Isabel arrived at the cafe early, her nerves fraying as she waited. She had brought Clara's journal with her, along with a few other old letters and photographs she had found in the storage boxes. Pieces of a life she had never fully understood, but that she was now desperate to piece together. Anna arrived a few minutes later, looking just as nervous as Isabel felt. She had tied her hair back, but her eyes still carried the same weight of sorrow that had struck Isabel when they first met. The two women exchanged awkward smiles before sitting down across from each other, the space between them filled with unsaid words. Isabel cleared her throat, her fingers tracing the edges of the journal in front of her. "I brought this," she said, her voice low. "It's my mother's journal. I found it after we talked at the cemetery. It's not easy to read, but I think you deserve to know what's inside." Anna hesitated, her eyes fixed on the worn cover of the journal. She looked as though she were afraid to touch it, afraid of what truths it might reveal. After a long moment, she reached out and took it, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the first page. For a while, they sat in silence, Anna reading, Isabel watching. Isabel could see the emotions flickering across Anna's face as she absorbed the words, the same words that had shaken Isabel to her core. Clara's pain, her guilt, her love, it was all there, laid bare in the messy, erratic handwriting that filled the pages. When Anna finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. She really cared about me, didn't she? Anna whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She wasn't just someone who gave me up and forgot about me. Isabel nodded, her own throat tightening with emotion. She did. She cared deeply. She just didn't know how to show it. Not to me, and apparently not to you either. But she never stopped thinking about you. That much I know. Anna wiped her tears with the back of her hand, sniffling softly. I've always felt lost, she admitted, her voice breaking, like I didn't belong anywhere, and now I don't know what to feel. I know, Isabel said softly. I felt that way too, but maybe we don't have to feel that way anymore. The two women sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared grief hanging between them. But there was something else too, something lighter, something new. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. Isabel reached across the table, her hand resting on Anna's. We don't have to figure everything out right now, she said gently, but maybe we can figure it out together. We don't have to be strangers anymore. Anna looked at Isabel, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but there was a flicker of something else in her gaze too, something like relief. I'd like that, she whispered. I'd like that a lot. Isabel smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in what seemed like years. For the first time since Clara's death, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew the road ahead would be difficult. But she wasn't alone anymore, and that, at least, was something to hold on to. A week had passed since Isabel and Anna sat together in the cafe, their lives intertwining in ways neither of them could have imagined. In that short time they had exchanged texts, calls, and stories, slowly unraveling the knots of confusion and pain that had shaped their respective lives. Isabel had been cautious at first, unsure of how to navigate this new relationship, but the more they spoke, the more she found herself drawn to Anna. There was an undeniable connection between them, a shared history, a shared wound, that made the past feel less suffocating. It was still early, though. Isabel knew better than to expect some sudden miracle of healing. Both she and Anna had lived too long with their own versions of loneliness, their own scars. But this, whatever this was, felt like a step forward, a crack of light in the darkness. Today, Isabel stood once again at Clara's grave. This time, Anna was with her. The two women stood side by side, the autumn wind rustling the leaves above them, a chill in the air that made Isabel pull her coat tighter around her. The cemetery was quiet, the silence comforting rather than oppressive. Isabel had expected to feel a surge of emotion standing here with Anna at her side, but instead she felt a strange sense of peace. It was as if the pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place, not perfectly, but enough to create a picture that made sense. We don't have to stay long, Isabel said softly, her voice carrying on the wind. I just thought it might help to be here together. Anna nodded, her arms crossed against the cold. She hadn't said much since they arrived, her expression distant, as if she were processing everything all over again. Isabel understood that. She was still processing too. They stood in silence for a few moments before Anna spoke, her voice quiet. I never thought I'd know who she was. I never thought I'd get any answers. Isabel glanced at her, noting the sadness in her voice. I know. I didn't either. And now we know more than we ever expected. Anna's lips curved into a bittersweet smile, though her eyes were still clouded with emotion. It's strange, isn't it, to finally know the truth and still feel like there's so much we'll never understand. Isabel nodded. Yeah, but I think that's part of it. There will always be things we don't know, things we'll never be able to ask. But at least we're not carrying the burden of not knowing anymore. Anna knelt down, her fingers brushing the cold stone of Clara's headstone. Isabel watched her, feeling a lump form in her throat. It was a surreal moment, seeing this girl, her sister in a way, kneeling at the grave of a woman who had connected them both through love and secrecy, through mistakes and hidden affection. "I wish I could have met her," Anna whispered, "even just once, to know what she was like in person." Isabel swallowed hard, the familiar ache of grief rising in her chest. "She was complicated," Isabel said softly, "but she was also strong. She had her reasons for what she did, even if we don't fully understand them." Anna nodded, but didn't say anything, her eyes focused on the gravestone. For a while, they stayed there in the quiet, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid hanging between them. And then slowly, Anna stood up, wiping the tears from her eyes. "I'm glad I found you," Anna said, her voice trembling slightly. Isabel looked at her, her own emotions threatening to spill over. "I'm glad too. I didn't think I'd ever find someone who understood what it was like, to feel like you've lost something before you even knew what it was." Anna met Isabel's gaze, her expression softening. "Maybe we can start something new. I know it's not the same as what we missed, but maybe it can still be something." Isabel smiled, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Yeah, I think it can." They stood there for a while longer, letting the moment sink in. And then, as the wind picked up and the sky darkened with the promise of rain, Isabel turned to Anna with a small, hopeful smile. "Come on," she said, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "Let's go." Later that afternoon, Isabel and Anna found themselves in a park not far from Isabel's apartment, sitting on a bench beneath a towering oak tree. The air was crisp, the leaves around them turning brilliant shades of gold and red. Isabel felt an unusual sense of calm. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she wasn't consumed by the weight of the past. Anna sat next to her, their shoulders nearly touching. They didn't speak much, but there was no need for words. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with a quiet understanding. Isabel watched as a group of children ran past, their laughter echoing through the park. She found herself smiling at the simple joy of it. "I've been thinking," Isabel said after a long while, breaking the silence, "about what you said, about starting something new." Anna turned to her, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "I've spent so long trying to be perfect," Isabel continued, her voice soft. "Trying to live up to my mother's expectations, even after she was gone. But now, I think I want to let go of that. I think I want to figure out who I am without all that pressure." Anna nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I get that. I've always felt like I didn't know who I was, like I was always searching for something that I couldn't quite find." "Maybe we can help each other," Isabel suggested. "We don't have to figure it all out right away, but we don't have to be alone anymore." Anna smiled, the sadness in her eyes softening. "I'd like that." They sat there together, watching as the sun began to set behind the trees, casting the park in a warm, golden glow. It felt like a new beginning. A chance to let go of the past and embrace the future, whatever it might hold. For the first time in years, Isabel felt a sense of peace settle over her. The secrets of the past were still there, but they no longer held the power they once did. She had Anna now, and together they could face whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Isabel glanced at Anna, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "You know," she said with a small smile, "I think we should plant a tree. Something new, something that will grow with us." Anna laughed, her voice filled with warmth. "A tree? That sounds kind of perfect." And as they sat there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade, Isabel knew that they had both found something they had been searching for: connection, understanding, and the promise of a future that was no longer defined by the pain of the past. The next day, Isabel and Anna returned to the cemetery, standing once more by Clara's grave. This time, they brought with them a small sapling, a symbol of renewal. Together, they planted it near Clara's resting place, a quiet tribute to the woman who had shaped their lives in ways they were only just beginning to understand. As they stood back and admired their work, Isabel felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The past was still there, but it no longer controlled her. And as she glanced at Anna, she knew that the future, though uncertain, was filled with possibility. For the first time in a long while, Isabel felt hopeful. And that, she realized, was enough.